Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second session of the Exeter Integration Conference. And I just wanted to start out by also thanking funders because this conference is partly supported by the Society and Cultures Institute at the University of Exeter, a small grant awarded to Christine and me. So the title of this session is Integration in Clinical Practice, which is a topic that I'm very interested in. I think, as you probably saw from Leo's workshop, or the feelings that we experience, that actually integration's a kind of life's work, and so it's quite hard to think of how we weave that into some of the clinical practices. But we know that psychedelics and this kind of way of practicing is being used in clinical settings, and so it's really important to think about how that might work. And I'm really delighted to welcome an incredible panel of speakers. Geoff Bathje, he's come over from the US, as has Paul, and I think they'll introduce themselves a bit more. And our last minute addition, who was, so the panel has been very fluid, who's very bravely come. She's just recovering from an ICPR-induced illness, so has come to talk to us today. So I think it'll be a really fascinating panel. And from my side, I got interested in this topic, and Christine and I started talking about it, really because I'm quite a newcomer to integration. I've been working with principally ketamine, and in that world, there wasn't a lot of chat of integration. There wasn't even a lot of chat of therapy, really. When we ran our first trial of adjunctive ketamine to psychological therapy, people thought that was weird enough to put therapy in it, let alone talk about integration. And it's something that's really come out of the psychedelic world. But it is really, really important, clearly, and something that happened after our first trial. A lot of participants came forward and said that they wanted an opportunity to share their experiences with other people. And so we and other people said to me, oh, you're not integrating people, that's unethical. But I looked at the kind of what integration was available in clinical trials, and it is a really tricky one, I think, because in a clinical trial, you have such a short time frame with which to work with people. And so some of the integration happened quite quickly after the experience. And I think that's something we need to know more about, is the kind of time course of the integration process. And also, how best to do it. I mean, I'm very lucky to be joined by a lot of therapists from our new trial. And in this phase 3 study that we're running across the UK with the same kind of ketamine-assisted model, we're looking at using a sort of peer support group at 6 months as part of the integration process. And hopefully that'll be something that's ongoing. But I'm hoping that we'll be informed by hearing from the very esteemed speakers today to potentially adjust our practice there. So I'll hand over for an introduction to what integration is to Geoff.
Can you hear me okay? Good, okay. Okay, so my name is Geoff Bathje, and I have been a professor, a researcher, also dabbled in things like community organizing, activism, and policy work. So coming at this from a bunch of different angles, and I'll try to cover some of those in the talk here today. Just a warning, I've been having a bit of allergies, and I don't know if I got the antihistamine to caffeine ratio right this morning, but I'll do my best. Okay, so this is the article I'll be referencing, which some of you might be familiar with. That was a synthesis and concept analysis of all the writing that had been done on psychedelic integration up until second half of 2022 when it published. This has also been adapted, if you're interested, for clinical practice into a website and a workbook on MAP's website. But you can look that up, it's open access. So first, just a little bit of background context. When I first started doing integration work in practice, sometimes people would ask, is this a legitimate therapy? Is this something totally experimental? And I do think integration is a concept that has been around for a while. The earliest reference I can find to it is Pierre Genet, 1889, who was a trauma therapist and whose work still impacts how we think about dissociation. He was a somatic therapist. Predecessor of Freud plagiarized him, actually. And so he defined traumatization as a failure of integrative capacity with the goal of therapy, restoration of the balance of the integrative experience, the ability to integrate new information and experiences. So in some ways, some overlap even with our modern way of thinking about it. Educational psychology has long recognized that we have a consolidation period between when we learn something and we become proficient at it and can actually apply it, right? So they don't use the word integration much from what I can see, but it's there. And then if we look back at the history of analytic therapy and the sheer number of hours and repetition that were in the early analytic therapies, as we move to a short-term model, maybe we've lost some of the importance of integration there. That maybe happened on its own a lot through repetition back in the day. Yet still a lot of therapists will incorporate various forms of homework, which I think do support integration. So I think the concept is all over the field of psychotherapy, education, even if it hasn't always been called that. And so we tried to synthesize a definition of integration. For this article, we looked at 20-some definitions of integration that were out there. Everyone kind of working in their own silos, and we came to this fairly lengthy definition, but I think it captures a complex topic fairly well. So integration being a process, very important. So a process in which a person revisits and actively engages in making sense of, working through, translating, and processing the content of their psychedelic experience. And then through an intentional effort and support in that practice, it allows one to gradually capture and incorporate the emergent lessons and insight into their lives. So that part being important too, that this in some way is transformative, comes forward into your life in some way, moves us then towards balance and wholeness along a bunch of different domains. And I'll point to those in a model that we came to in a minute here. There's that. So this model wasn't something we invented, but was the attempt to synthesize 10 different frameworks, models, approaches to integration that we found in the literature. When I started thinking about this project in about 2017, it was because in my own training, there was a lot of questions around what is integration? How do you do it? There's a sense that it's important, but we don't really know what it is or why you would recommend one or the other of these various practices to somebody to help their integration. And then seems like a lot of other people were asking that same question, because in 2017, the first book focused totally on integration that I'm aware of was published. But the other 9 models, I think all the rest of them were published in the last 5 years. So then we went from kind of a deficit of information around integration to a flood of information, everybody working in their own silos, which I think caused a different sort of confusion. And so the goal here was to kind of pull that together in a way to say, how are people thinking about this? How are people working with it? This is intended to be a holistic model. So you had these 6 domains at the center of the hexagon. And so the idea being that these aren't separate, that these are different aspects of our experience, our mental, emotional, contemplative capacities, our body and somatic experience, spiritual, existential, ritual practices, beliefs, our connection to the natural world, our relationships and sense of community, and then our lifestyle and actions. And so there might have been a few other things, and I'll give you an additional model you can think about with this that I would have put in here if I were starting from scratch, but we were trying to synthesize what had been written rather than invent something new. And then you have this outer ring of different continuum on which you can think about integrative practices so that people can also choose a balance of what they're doing, things that are more passive, things that are more actively engaging that process, for example. And so the goal here then is a balance of attention to the different domains. And you might have already, as you're looking at this, realized you could kind of use this as a bit of an assessment too, right? So for any of these domains, you can ask, where am I giving more attention? What am I giving less attention to in my integration? And then it's not just the balance between them, but the relationships between them. So at what point are there tensions between these areas? At what points are they complementary? So an example I might give is if we think about the natural world and environmental threats that we're experiencing globally, how does that impact our emotional state? How does that impact our emotional well-being? How do contaminants and things in the environment impact the body and our somatic experience? How do those interact to impact our communities, our spiritual development, right? So you can take any two or more of these and think about them in relation to each other and how they either help or hinder, or so where they're out of balance, where there's dissonance, or where there's synergy. Let's see. And so I did want to note that a number of these authors talked about being inspired by indigenous wellness practices. As far as I know from looking at their bios, none of the authors that we relied on identify as indigenous themselves. So that could be a gap, but just wanted to comment on that as well. We also reviewed a giant list of integrative practices. If you look at the online version of this article rather than the PDF, that can be easy to miss. But there were more than 120 or so different specific practices that were recommended to support integration. These were the themes and categories that we identified those as falling within. So again, I sometimes will ask clients to look at that list before they even come to the psychedelic experience as part of their preparation. What are the practices they're already engaged in? What are the ways that they already prefer to process things? And then what are the things that might challenge them in new areas that aren't getting as much attention? So that can be a helpful process going into the experience as they're planning to make some space and time for integration. So I won't go into that too much because it's a giant list, but can give people ideas. So kind of expanding beyond that model and that synthesis of information. The one thing that wasn't quite captured here was thinking kind of politically and contextually beyond the person and the things that immediately are part of their experience. And so this isn't the only model, but I like Bronfenbrenner's ecological model as a way of thinking of the person within context and within systems, if you're not familiar with it. So we have the developing child in the center here, all the more immediate or proximal things that impact them, like their family, their community, maybe their religious community, friends, workplace of the parents. And then those are all situated within additional larger contexts, right? So we move out to the laws, the education system, the type of political system, the type of economy, that these all impact those relationships and the choices that people have available to them. And then beyond that, we have the macro system, the norms and values of the culture, things like racism, patriarchy, broader isms can fall under there. But also just the worldviews of that culture. And then this all exists over time and is impacted by historical influences. So things like growing up during a pandemic or a war or things like that. All right, so this kind of gets us even further out beyond the individual. Looking at a model like this is intended to contradict some of the neoliberal sense of individualism, which is so prevalent in Western culture, that these systems are always present for us, always interacting with each other, and that those impact the health and wellness of the people, where we just perceive ourselves as the individual and maybe take on a lot of responsibility for how we're feeling, but it has a context, and our options are partly defined within that context. So particularly coming from the United States, where these neoliberal beliefs have been propagandized and intended to very much bury and suppress the collectivist movements of the 1960s and 70s. It can be really difficult even to hold your thought beyond the individual level. And so in therapy, we're often bringing in what I think are not the most helpful individualistic ideas, promoting things like rigid boundaries over relationships and community building. And so in ways that can kind of isolate people further, rather than encourage them to learn how to work constructively with other people. And so then it's important to reflect on how we might have the freedom to integrate the insights and experiences that we have based on all this context. And so one example of that would be if you work with somebody who's very wealthy, they might have the ability to abruptly go and open a retreat center in another country. And so you might have to encourage them to slow down for their integration process. Somebody who doesn't have as many resources might have things where they want to make a big shift, but they just don't have the means to do that. It's going to be more of an incremental and gradual approach given the restrictions of their context. And so you might have to work with a person to be more patient and systematic at how they go about doing their integration as far as bringing things into their life. Makes sense? Yeah, okay. And so if we contrast this model, which is intended to be very holistic and balanced wellness model, if I were to try to depict the standard Western mind, I think it's marked by a lot of fragmentation and dualisms and objectification. And so we might identify ourselves primarily as a mind who is in ownership of a body, which we do like rent out for things like labor. And we engage in behaviors generally out of some sort of necessity or pleasure. We have these dialectics between self and other, between person and nature, a lot of other dialectics. And so these other things become kind of objects, they become objectified and outside of ourselves. And some more to note, if this is kind of the basis of the culture, we built a medical model out of that culture, and the medical model helped to construct that culture as well. And so that model often we will tend to either mind or behavior or body, usually not all of those things. And we usually don't have a whole lot of interest or knowledge about what to do about these other things if they're impacting a person, right? So we're working within a model that's kind of fragmented and provides some challenges. So then we have these non-ordinary states of consciousness, as we call them, that might really disrupt all of that and get us more in touch with a holistic sense of self, to where we have things like an interesting mind-body experience. And so we often use the phrase ordinary state of consciousness to refer to our day-to-day, right? And Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, wrote about a psychopathology of the average in Western cultures. And so at the top of that pyramid was self-actualization, but Maslow also wrote a bit about the ways that the culture itself could get in the way of people being able to engage in self-actualization or accomplish that. And so we are kind of chronically in this paternalistic state of deference to different systems, to nation states, to corporations and capitalism. We, because of that dependence, it kind of assures we won't resist a whole lot, at least in dramatic ways. And so that enables inequalities of power and wealth that can kind of get in the way of our individual integration that we're attempting to accomplish. Yeah, so this leaves us vulnerable. Karl Marx had a theory called alienation theory, which was not really well elaborated. Maybe Erich Fromm was the one who best elaborated it in some of his psychological work. And so out of that sense of dependence, some have used the word domestication. We're often kind of lacking in our survival skills, unable to pursue our instincts that we might get in touch with through psychedelic experience, and then have a lot of trouble integrating as a result. And so can have an impact on our mental health, leave us in a chronic state of being disturbed or labeled as ill, when in fact that has a larger social context, as I'm proposing here, right? It's not just about the deficits within the person, even if the suffering is experienced within the person. And just want to point out, so going back to the indigenous thought here, that the indigenous critiques of lack of freedom, collectivism, and egalitarianism date back quite a ways. So it's coming up again in our current psychedelic renaissance, but also seem to have an impact the first time around as Europeans ran into indigenous thought. So it had a role in the European Enlightenment and Renaissance. Great book by David Graeber and Wengrow called the, yeah, thank you. I didn't write it, but called The Dawn of Everything, that goes into some of that history. So another question that often comes up is, why do Westerners need integration, with the implication that indigenous people seem not to need a formal integration process as much? And so I want to make clear that all life forms, all beings require an adequate balance of the essential ingredients of their existence in order to thrive. So if we go back to this model, for a plant, it might be not these items, it might be things like soil and nutrients and water and air and sunlight. So it's a little bit simpler, but still plants need an integration of all those conditions of their existence if they're going to survive. If any of them are out of balance or lacking, they may not survive, or at least will not be thriving, right? And so humans in that sense are no different in their context, just maybe more complex. Outside of Western medicine, there's a pretty universal recognition of the need to attune to balance and holism throughout the lifetime as a daily practice. So pattern thinking is learned, systems thinking is learned from an early age. Attunement to the social network is learned from an early age. And so one of the ideas being then that indigenous people might just have a more holistic system, whereas we have an illness-based system, right? So what is wellness in Western medicine? It's the absence of illness. It's just negatively defined, right? Whereas indigenous models are wellness models with a lot of emphasis on balance and integration. And so another reason why Westerners might need integration is we're often, as you might be surmising here, coming to these experiences pretty disintegrated in the first place, approaching the psychedelic experience with pretty narrow goals. So I did another qualitative study a few years ago where I talked to Westerners who are traveling to shamanic contexts for ayahuasca experiences. We asked them what their intention was going in. It was almost always for a diagnosis. And then we asked them what happened, what was the impact of that experience, and it was always much, much broader than a diagnosis. So we're coming in unprepared for the breadth and the depth of the experiences we're having, and then we may not have much of a framework to work with all aspects of that experience in an integrative way. And so I think we're kind of disadvantaged in doing our integration from the models we come in with to how we approach it to how we work with it afterwards. And so from this standpoint, then I propose that psychedelics are not so much creating the disturbance or the rupture, that was a great word that Leo used, not so much creating that as they are highlighting the disturbances and ruptures and imbalances that are pre-existing as a condition of our place in our cultural position. So I do still think I'm not of the opinion that we need to ban the use of psychedelics in medicine or interfere with that, as some are advocating for. I do think psychedelics within a medical model can have help with specific psychological pain points, traumas, problems in childhood and upbringing. I think it can help resolve those things in interesting ways. But I do think we need a substantial revision to those models to promote prevention, wellness, and thriving. And so I am kind of excited to see psychedelics come into a medical model just to see what it will do to the medical model. And to the people who are trying to work with psychedelics within that model, I think you very quickly will find out that those models are inadequate, and you'll have to start thinking about things like nature that you haven't spent a whole lot of time on, or the body, or things that you haven't spent so much time on in psychological training. And maybe other areas of medicine will just kind of ignore and be uninterested in psychedelics because they're so unfamiliar and unpredictable in that way. I'm more skeptical and more concerned about the integration of psychedelics within capitalism. So I do think they can be objectified and compartmentalized and potentially harmful to people who are trying to use them in narrow ways without adequate supports, without adequate preparation. But within the medical model, I'm kind of excited to see what they do to the medical model. Hopefully, as researchers, we can kind of get beyond just thinking at the individual level and think about how our stance within Western culture impacts us psychologically and physically, how it impacts our well-being in all senses, and be reflective on, as we work with psychedelics and as we see people have these more holistic experiences that involve the whole person, to maybe get past what I would call our collective cultural bypass, right? So if psychedelics are about things like interconnectedness, and that comes up a lot for people. What are we doing to support people collectively? And I think the medical model, capitalist business structures are ways of kind of bypassing the more disruptive and less palatable aspects of psychedelics and retaining the things that we're more familiar with and that are more profitable. So in conclusion here, if we really listen to psychedelics and what people are telling us from those experiences and what you're having from your own experiences, I think it'll give us an opportunity to reflect on the state and the conditions of the world and how that impacts people, which might give us some complex and difficult things that we need to integrate, not just individually, but collectively. So that's my hope, is that we'll take a look at those things. Thank you.
Questions? Yeah. We do a few just for Geoff, and then we'll do some at the end. Does anyone have any questions? Well, I was interested in the cultural bypass aspects. And just what you were saying, essentially, I think, is that we enter into these experiences quite unprepared, and that's why the need for integration. Is there any way of kind of culturally preparing people? Can you see in this space?
Yeah, so culturally preparing people, and I'm a therapist as well, so I've been doing ketamine assisted therapy for the past 8 years, have worked in harm reduction as well. And I think in harm reduction, it's a place where we often talk about the political, we talk about the context of a drug war and how that impacts people, and how the things they're experiencing aren't only a product of trauma, even though I think that's an important lens too, but they're also these systemic level traumas of incarceration and classism and racism that come into play. And so I think having conversations with clients to get them to reflect on the structural and systemic things that are impacting them. And then from there, how do we still move forward within systems that aren't necessarily going to support us moving forward? It's important to kind of be able to have both conversations, both the focus on the individual experience and suffering, but also the context of that, the bigger context. And I think that's especially effective in group settings where people can kind of see they're coming in with the same stories, the same experiences, and makes it easier to see what's mine, what's individual, and what's not, what's bigger stuff.
Maybe pass the microphone.
Oh, yeah. Here's another one. There you go. And I can run around. Is that on? Okay.
Thank you. Just thinking about the preparation and integration model that one might study when you're studying to be a psychedelics assisted therapist. I was at ICPR on the weekend, and I saw presentations from Australia and Switzerland. And in the Australian model, it's like a 9-month psychotherapy with the psychedelics embedded within it, and I think the Swiss model is a year. So there's a lot of preparation. I think there's 6 months, maybe 6 months preparation in the Australian model before somebody would actually take psychedelic medicine, and I think something similar in maybe longer even, I don't know, in the Swiss model. But do you think that would be, I suppose, following on from what you were saying, would that therefore be helpful to have a longer preparation period, which is sometimes like a couple of sessions before the actual taking of the medicine? But in what you've been saying, it really makes sense to have that long-term preparation where these things that you speak about can be considered and integrated, and so that the mindset is in a much more receptive state, maybe, and not so that the experience isn't such an ontological shock, so it's not as shocking. I wonder what your thoughts were about that.
Definitely providing some space for preparation is important. I think the balance to strike is we make that too long, it becomes a barrier to access and entry into services, right? And so I'm usually doing 3 or 4 preparation sessions for clients who are doing ketamine assisted therapy. One of the ways to make it easier on myself is I wrote this article so that I could provide some of my thinking and framework to clients. So I often do share it with them. But I think there are, the theoretical orientation you use is important. So I wouldn't necessarily want somebody getting 9 months of a hyper individualistic theoretical orientation. I don't necessarily think that would make them more prepared. There are theories that attempt to be more structural and political in their thinking, feminist therapies, narrative therapy, some of the multicultural therapies. So I think practicing from those introduces a way to talk about some of these contexts beyond the individual with people in their preparation. And then working with what comes out of that too is important. Yeah.
Oh, I think so. But we were going to have a panel at the end. I'm just going to take one question from online. Is that okay? Because so that is, could the speaker share more about what the evidence is of his claim that Indigenous communities don't have integration? What this is based on? Is this universally true or specific to certain communities? And if there are equivalent practices to integration in these communities that showed up in your paper? I think obviously we'll have a session on this, a panel later today, but if you wanted to talk from the perspective of yours.
Fine with saving that for the anthropologist. Yeah.
Okay, cool. We'll save that one for the anthropologists. So maybe one quick question, Amadeus. We have an anthropologist.
Hiya. I thought that was amazing. I thought it was brilliant. And these are things that I think about often as well. Like in the diagram, you had like the outermost circle was about systems of values, and so you're talking about capitalism and that the systems that we're embedded in are partly what contribute to making us, or some people, sick. But how do we incorporate this systems thinking into integration without being prescriptive about what value systems may be better, right? Because you potentially then fall into the trap of something like a Marxist kind of false consciousness, insofar as like, I know plenty of capitalists who are like perfectly happy and well adjusted. Not that I agree with capitalism personally, but it becomes kind of normative, right? When we're saying these values are essentially not working or bad and potentially should be avoided. So what else? Because re-envisioning a system of values, it's a huge task. It's a collective task. It's an ethical and philosophical task. But I wonder, is it like maybe an evidence-based thing that you might be working from? Like, is it something that it would, like, for example, we can see that like pro-sociality could improve mental health, but like, are there other, like, what is the basis of the re-envisioning of values?
I think if we go all the way back to Darwin, who wrote a lot more about our social nature than our competitive nature, and how that was misrepresented. I think there are plenty of things we can point to in the history of science and social sciences to provide ideas to give people more options of how they want to think about things. So I don't have a problem with introducing ideas, recognizing them as ideas, that people have the choice of whether they adopt those or not. Encouraging people to reflect on what their values are is a great thing to incorporate in therapy. And often you'll get to some of these things anyway, especially if you're able to do that collectively in group contexts. I do highly recommend, if you've ever studied community psychology, is a really great way of kind of looking at everything beyond the individual and how that contributes to our collective well-being. And so I think it's probably where the best research base is that I'm aware of and that I try to bring in. But yeah.
Okay, so it's such an interesting discussion, and we'll have to move on now. Not have to. It was wonderful to move on because I can now welcome our next speaker. Oh, did I do something bad? Joseph Foley, by the way. Sorry, I've done something weird there. He's Paul Gillis-Smith. He's from Harvard and is going to talk to us about, I'm using to Harvard Divinity School, is that right? Yeah. To talk to us about using chaplaincy in ketamine assisted therapy. So I'll hand.
Thank you. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Paul Gillis-Smith. I'm a recent graduate from Harvard's Master of Divinity program, and I'm an incoming project lead for the study on psychedelics in society and culture at Harvard Divinity School's Center for the Study of World Religions. A huge thanks to all of our organizers for this conference, to Christine Hoskeller, Mark Schuneman, Joseph Crickmore, Anya Ovcharenko, and the chair of this panel, Celia Morgan, and to my co-panelists, Geoff and Roz. I must say I feel a little bit out of my depth today and quite humbled presenting alongside the two of you with your wealth of experience and leadership in this field. So I have a few remarks to share with you about my work in spiritual care integration for ketamine patients. I'll clarify some introductory terms to situate us all, and then speak on the word psychedelic and its relationship to ketamine, and further the psychedelic and its relationship to chaplaincy. Then I'll provide my understanding of integration based on my set as a chaplain, my setting in an American hospital, and share what our program looks like. And I'll conclude with some implications that I see chaplaincy might offer to the field of psychedelic therapy and integration more broadly. So I was invited to speak to you all today about my experience working as a hospital chaplain during my graduate studies. where I provided spiritual care to patients receiving ketamine and S-ketamine for major depressive disorder. Now, just in this brief introduction, there are two key terms that may require some further elaboration for this audience: S-ketamine for one, and chaplaincy or spiritual care for two. Now, S-ketamine. We hear about ketamine more often, sometimes associated in the underground with raves and K-holes under the name Special K or simply K. Ketamine was first synthesized in 1962 by a Park Davis chemist, patented by the company in 1965 as an anesthetic for humans and other animals. Ketamine became much more popular in the late 70s, following John Lilly's personal testimonial in his book, The Scientist. In the 2010s, there was a swell of research into ketamine's utility for the treatment of depression, and the American Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, granted ketamine breakthrough designation in order to fast-track clinical trials. This is not my expertise at all, but it's worth a couple notes here on the difference between ketamine and S-ketamine, at least to highlight how drug patents work in the clinical context. So ketamine is what is called a racemic mixture, meaning that it includes an equal mixture of two enantiomers, or compounds that are mirror images of each other, like our hands, yet not identical to each other. Thus, the two can be separated into each enantiomer, S-ketamine, R-ketamine. The S-ketamine enantiomer has a much higher binding affinity to NMDA receptors, which is an inhibitory receptor for glutamate, which is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter in human brains. And we believe it to be in part responsible for neuronal plasticity and memory formation. So what ketamine and S-ketamine do is block the reception of glutamate by NMDA receptors, allowing for glutamate to basically run wild through our brain. And while the causal mechanism is still unknown, this glutamate action is thought to be the potential cause of ketamine's antidepressive effects. So as glutamate is blocked at the NMDA receptors, it passes through the AMPA receptors, whose mediating role of glutamate transmission is responsible for the molecular machinery of memory and learning. So thus, given ketamine's mechanism of action and glutamate's transmission through the molecular activities that undergird memory and learning, it seems to play a crucial role in what we might call consciousness and the various activities associated with it: insight, intuition, discovery, etc. So because of this binding affinity to NMDA receptors that S-ketamine has, Janssen Pharmaceuticals pushed forward Spravato, a nasal spray form of S-ketamine. Janssen received FDA and European Medicines Agency approval for their Spravato S-ketamine in 2019. And it's the brand of S-ketamine offered at the hospital where I did my work, and the primary ketamine or ketamine adjacent drug prescribed there as well. Now for chaplaincy, or spiritual care, as it's often called now. Chaplain has a Latin origin, capellanus, named as such because the capellani protected the relic of 4th century Saint Martin. There he is. Half of his capa, or cape, is the relic. The other half was given to a beggar. The name was later given to the building that the capellani and their relic, the capella, would occupy, the chapel. From the 6th to the 9th centuries, the capellani became clerical ministers appointed by the king, and they were associated with monarchical or military duties along with guarding the relics. Thus, the chaplain, differentiated from the minister or the monastic, had a specific assignment to a personage, typically a royal leader. But it was not until the early 20th century that chaplaincy became associated with assignment to a new personage, the patient and their hospitals, the more immediate legacy of my own discipline. Given this deep Christian association with chaplaincy, contemporary practitioners have often opted for the more neutral spiritual care. So I'll use the two terms interchangeably here. Hospital chaplaincy has its origins in psychiatry, perhaps making it uniquely attuned for its current charge in psychedelic medicine. The founder of hospital chaplaincy, Anton Boysen, was a mental patient himself. He carried a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and it was during his first institutionalization in a Boston asylum that he had the idea, or perhaps the revelation, for religious officials taking a place in the asylum staff. For Anton Boysen, chaplaincy was a project intended specifically for mentally ill patients, and it was the work of the chaplain to help patients make sense of their psychosis on a different set of terms than those provided by clinical staff. It was Boyson's belief that one man's psychosis may be another's religious experience. This was his own issue during his hospitalization. Boyson understood his psychotic thinking as an altered state for otherwise inaccessible creativity or problem solving, and brought on by a set of circumstances of duress that required a new view of a situation. And he yearned for the help of a professional with religious training to help him make sense of these experiences on the terms of religion, a chaplain. Not 5 years after his internment, his first internment, first of 5, in an asylum, did he become the first of such chaplains. In his first major text on madness and religious experience, The Exploration of the Inner World, Boyson describes his patients as prophets, always ready to put them into conversation with the likes of Jesus Christ, St. Paul of Tarsus, and George Fox. Thus, as a discipline, spiritual care must always acknowledge and be responsive to the wisdom of a patient. So as with the psychopharmacology of ketamine, the history of chaplaincy and its knotty relationship with the history of psychiatry and madness is not the subject of my lecture today. I'll only highlight here that this loose class of psychedelic drugs have also been called psychosis-inducing or psychotomimetic in the past. Given chaplaincy's history as psychiatrically oriented and specially invested in questions of madness, the chaplain seems uniquely fit to work with patients enduring what one may call a sort of madness and taking a drug that some continue to claim is madness-inducing. So perhaps I can speak more to these themes in our Q&A. So hopefully this meandering introduction helps us situate us all a bit in who I am as I stand before you today. Now, to turn to the psychedelic of psychedelic integration, the theme of this ongoing colloquium that hosts our conference. I keep a running list for every name I hear for this poorly defined class of psychotropic drugs. Among them includes, of course, the early option offered by Huxley, phanerothym, in the now apocryphal limerick, to make this trivial world sublime, take 0.5 gram phanerothym. Less well known are psychophrenic, psychoplastic, psychorexic, psychohormic, phaneropsychic, psychophan, and on and on. And just as coming to a single word for this loose set of drugs poses a challenge, there is a similar ambivalence about which drugs count as sufficiently psychedelic. With a fairly quick Google search, I encountered a handful of blog posts from various American ketamine providers, each offering beautifully contradictory declarations. Why ketamine is a psychedelic. Why ketamine infusion therapy is not psychedelic therapy. Why ketamine is a psychedelic and why it matters. Is ketamine a psychedelic? Does it matter? Suffice it to say, the American mental health care industry appears divided over the use value of calling ketamine a psychedelic. Perhaps it is for the curious associations that psychedelic picked up since the word's invention in 1956. Ketamine is unique in the psychedelic landscape as it did not experience the same crackdown under the 1970 Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act in the US. In fact, in the very year that this was the very year that it was approved for clinical use as an anesthetic by the FDA. So since the 1980s, psychiatric researchers have explored the novel potentials of this drug for mental health benefits. Like many novel explorations by psychiatrists, clinicians threw every diagnosis in the kitchen sink at it to see what might stick. Substance use disorders, treatment refractory depression, anxiety, PTSD, BPD, OCD, and on and on and on. Given ketamine's peculiar phenomenological effects, a sense of disconnection from the body, a feeling of thoughts running loose through one's mind, the odd hallucination, perhaps, psychedelic therapy, as a term, has been lent credence as a paradigm of care for patients receiving this drug. Now, there's the previously noted consternation over whether it counts sufficiently as a psychedelic. Psychedelic has never had a clear-cut definition. It gestures to a loose set of drugs, psilocybin-containing mushrooms, Amanita muscaria, LSD, occasionally MDMA, peyote, 2CB, DMT, etc. It's also a visual aesthetic. It's a musical genre. It's a literary style, or it's simply used to denote the weird. Perhaps this is why psychedelic therapy might be so easily established as a new kind of therapy. A new book, a new drug, a new chord progression, a new therapy. To my mind, psychedelic chaplaincy serves as an intervention to this hermeneutic of novelty that governs the meaning of psychedelic. One of the few publications on psychedelic chaplaincy Chaplaincy and Psychedelic Therapy, Opportunities and Barriers, offers several crucial observations on how chaplaincy might be uniquely equipped to address this hermeneutic of novelty. First, as noted earlier, clinical chaplaincy has its roots in providing care for people experiencing non-ordinary states of consciousness. Second, the discipline of chaplaincy provides a standard of care and expertise that is not rooted in the newness of psychedelicism, but in the accredited training by the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education, or the ACPE. The ACPE is not a licensing board for psychedelic chaplains. Rather, it is an accrediting and educating organization for all chaplains and spiritual care providers in all settings. The philosophy of the ACPE is that the clinical pastoral education provides the skills for the variety of contexts that chaplains find themselves in with the same standard of care. An ethic of compassion, non-anxious presence, interreligious and interspiritual sensitivity, withholding the need to find solutions, staying present through challenging and painful situations, and holding space for non-ordinary states, among other competencies. I once heard it said that to be a good psychedelic therapist, one must become a good therapist. I do hope that this is borne out in anyone who is invested in psychedelic therapy, although a number of disclosures from MDMA clinical trials suggest that the power dynamics and impressionable states fomented by these novel therapeutics has been abused by some therapists. Certainly not a majority, but troublesome nonetheless. Similarly, I think that to be a psychedelic chaplain, one must become a good chaplain. Because the training for chaplaincy is the same for anyone's domain of spiritual care, this creates a stopgap for someone with myopic interest in psychedelics, as they receive the same training as someone in palliative care, inpatient psychiatric care, or general inpatient internal medicine care. The same competencies apply for all patient populations, and those interested in ketamine, psilocybin, or MDMA chaplaincy have much to learn from their peers working in other spheres of spiritual care. I took this call myself, and I split my clinical time evenly between working with patients receiving ketamine and general psychiatric patients in a locked ward and in a day program. So this paucity that chaplaincy provides to the impulse towards psychedelic novelty is an integral parallel to the history of psychedelics more generally. As mentioned, psychedelic is a new term. It's often applied retroactively to plants, fungi, and chemicals found transculturally and transhistorically. Nobody in South America who drank ayahuasca ceremonially considered their practice psychedelic until fairly recently, if at all. Mazatec healers in Chotachine in Oaxaca were not referring to their mushrooms as psychedelics, and they did not consider their work psychedelic therapy. And the use of ergotized grain, which is chemically similar to LSD, was not considered psychedelic at any point in history when it may have been used for cultic or pharmacological ends. Chaplaincy walks in step with this history. There's no need to appeal to the novel. Psychedelic chaplaincy is not a new approach. To be sure, chaplaincy in a psychedelic setting may have new lessons for spiritual care in other domains, but psychedelic chaplaincy is chaplaincy first. Psychedelic chaplaincy, then, is a particular flavor of this integration that we're interrogating here. I think the theme of this conference is terrific, as it's dealing head-on with an often ill-defined, or at least multifariously defined concept. My own use of the term feels mostly out of necessity, as it's become the recognized currency for therapeutically relating to care seekers receiving psychotropic drugs. And there are many ways in which spiritual care is wholly related to integration in the many contexts that one might find a chaplain, from the prison to the military to the university to the hospital. And I think it's worth revisiting our old friends Gottfried Leibniz and Bernard Riemann in their early formulations of the integral and his notation with the extended S for summa, calculating a sum of a line under a curve. Our mathematician friends aid us in an understanding of integration, wherein it is a project of generating a sum by calculating an infinite number of discrete moments under a curve, or such a curve in integration is the arc of a life. Spiritual care is uniquely attuned to how a patient is making sense or struggling to do so of a particular clinical encounter, or of the infinity of moments that comprise a clinical experience, whether they are receiving acute care in an ICU, recovering from a surgical procedure, enduring a short-term psychiatric stay, or processing a ketamine infusion. A chaplain usually steps into a patient's life for only a brief moment to ask, "What the hell do you make of all this?" Or at least that's what I'm usually asking. At times, my work as a chaplain seems at a distance from the immediate cure of bodily suffering. I don't perform surgeries, I don't prescribe medication, I'm not even changing wound dressings or even bed linens. Yet these encounters are an attempt at integrating, at making sense of the often dehumanizing or at least confusing set of experiences that make up what we call healthcare. Our approach to ketamine spiritual care integration deviates from the standard practice in contemporary spiritual care in that it is not a brief single visit, but it resonates with a longer history of chaplaincy and Anton Boyson's work in mental institutions, where we have the opportunity to connect with care seekers over weeks or months. Our program currently consists of 8 one-on-one integration sessions on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, followed by an opt-in integration group, which meets for 8 sessions. Our integration clinic is interdisciplinary. It's currently consisting of 2 Divinity School student chaplains, 2 psychiatric medical residents, and the hospital's spiritual care manager. As ketamine is self-administered, and patients receive their infusion in an outpatient infusion center. So it looks just like this, with supervision from a nursing team, which I would argue this setting does not make for a conducive environment to pleasant or rewarding experiences. And it has been a central and ongoing complaint from our patient population. Thus, our integration time is sometimes focused on helping patients control the environment in any way they can. Some opt for eye shades, noise-canceling headphones, particular playlists, or recordings of words from loved ones. Luckily, the hospital is just across the street from an arboretum. And I encourage many patients to go for a walk through the park to ground themselves before or after the infusion. So despite the difference from standard contemporary hospital chaplaincy in the amount of time that we get to spend with a patient, I'm typically asking the same question that I would of any patient on any floor of the hospital. What the hell do you make of all this? A patient responds, and often embedded in their response is a request for a particular helping role. Patients are so rarely asked to integrate their clinical experiences by their own care providers, and even more rarely asked to tell their story in this setting. But this is the task of integration: to sum up, to tell one's story, to bring together an infinite number of moments into what could be construed as a whole. Integration as a mathematical function, or as a catch-all term that is slid into psychedelic therapy, eschews the arduous nature of calculating such a sum, of bringing together one's experience in a meaningful way. And in such an integration, we may require more than one role to help us in the process. Some care seekers are looking for patient advocates. Others are looking for a psychotherapist with particular training, internal family systems, EMDR, psychodynamic therapy, etc. Some are looking for information or for answers, phenomenological, theological, neurological, or most of all, is what I am experiencing normal? Am I crazy? Some are seeking some sort of accountability. As practitioners facilitating integration, we are often asked to step into many of these roles at the same time. And chaplains cannot answer all of these requests. We're not therapists. We do not have deep psychopharmacological knowledge. We are not patient advocates. Yet it is integral to integration that we walk with a patient in their process of understanding what it is they're looking for, what roles they're requesting of me, the practitioner, and what they are looking for from this treatment. For those among us who walk through the world with depression, it may have been a long time since you had an answer to this question of what you're looking for beyond, I am looking to no longer be depressed. Ketamine opens a unique possibility because it is so fast-acting. These standard measures of depression, like mood or energy level, might suddenly be much higher than they have been for a long time, sometimes 5, 10, 20 years. And it can be incredibly destabilizing to have a new wellspring of energy that was inaccessible for years. Perhaps we're thinking about the future, or even making plans more than a week out for the first time. In the chaplaincy biz, we call that hope. What spiritual care looks like here is walking with someone as they respond to these questions. More often than not, we find that just being curious about the question, the search for an answer, is more elucidating and self-empowering than the answer itself. One common word for this practice is witness. We ask someone about what is going on in this moment, and we refuse to turn away, no matter how troublesome, disturbing, or uncomfortable their response is. And as chaplains, we're also specially attuned to the religious or spiritual stakes of one's experience. As mentioned earlier, chaplaincy does not provide a theological frame to a care seeker's experience, but meets them on their own turf. This is of profound ethical import, as it may be easy for someone facilitating integration to provide their own interpretation of a patient's experience and nudge their treatment experiences in a particular direction, and consequently, the meaning the patient makes of those experiences. I'll give an example. I saw a patient who was raised conservative and Pentecostal Christian, who had since been divorced from an abusive partner and had not been to church in many years. When I asked about her relationship to her tradition these days, she expressed feeling quite far from God. Maybe she was even angry at God, but she was unsure how to express it. We then explored what it might mean to express anger at God, and where in her tradition there was room for expressing that anger. We turned to Lamentations, and we considered how we might connect to God, even in the midst of our anger. Her response at the end of our time together was something along the lines of, "I've never had someone in healthcare help me process parts of my spiritual life. No one has asked me about the spiritual aspects of my mental health." These conversations are each singular. No two people have the same relationship to or understanding of religion or spirituality. Thus, one cannot take any sort of engagement with religion for granted. And likewise, one must not suggest that a particular sort of religious or spiritual experience may arise from ketamine treatments. I've heard everything from swimming in the glory of God, to descending into hell, to facing down one's own mortality, to basking in the divine light of the universe, to just generally feeling weird for 45 minutes, to totally materialist practices of drug-assisted meditation, as he called them, during the treatment. Thus, I see a crucial lesson that the discipline of spiritual care may offer to integration more generally. Psychedelic science has certainly taken an interest in the presence of spiritual, existential, religious, or theological experiences occasioned by psychoactive drugs, often terming and quantifying them as mystical experiences. Moreover, one line of research investigates whether this mystical quality is also what holds the curative potential, and the project becomes one of boosting the mysticism per the questionnaire of the day. Beyond simply gesturing to a mystical quality, whose definition and character is concretized through a survey of dubious philosophical underpinnings, chaplaincy offers a method of non-imposition and a reliance upon interreligious or interspiritual knowledge. Given the import of the religious dimension of these experiences, for one to integrate this experience well, it should cohere, or at least be in conversation with, one's own positionality in relation to religion or spirituality. Of course, this may also include tabling the conversation on religion or spirituality, should one not bring it to the surface at all, and providing reassurance that one is not broken or doing it wrong if the experience does not possess a spiritual quality, or if each experience is not as impactful or glorious as the last. So by way of conclusion, I'd like to share a few lines from a poem by Walt Whitman, an American transcendentalist and who are the 19th century progenitors of explorations into contact with the divine, from which the psychedelic Renaissance inherits much. Whitman's poem, The Wound Dresser, provides an elaboration of the work of witness in spiritual care that I simply have not seen stated so clearly anywhere else. Despite our difference in time and setting, as Whitman writes of a wound dresser in a field hospital on a Civil War battlefield some 160 years ago, I find a point of touch through time as we both reckon with the suffering that we witness and a sense of inadequacy of addressing it in the moment. In the American healthcare landscape, I've witnessed far more systemic crises that seem to generate, or at least exacerbate, our mental illnesses than any innate chemical imbalance. Problems of education, of social immobility, of housing, of healthcare costs, at least in the US, of global instability and conflict, these all go ill-addressed by any of the tools at our disposal in psychiatric intervention. From my vantage point as a spiritual care provider, it is the work of witness, of letting people tell as much of their story as they can, and of seeking out spiritual resources together, that has not ameliorated any of these conditions, but illustrated the depth of our collective pain, and let us find new ways to name it together. So I'll let Whitman speak here. Now be witness again. Paint the mightiest armies of earth, of those armies so rapid, so wondrous. What saw you to tell us? What stays with you latest and deepest? Of curious panics, of hard-fought engagements or sieges tremendous, what deepest remains? Bearing the bandages, water and sponge, Straight and swift to my wounded I go, where they lie on the ground after the battle brought in, where their priceless blood reddens the grass, the ground. Or to the rows of the hospital tent, or under the roofed hospital. To the long rows of cots up and down each side I return. To each and all, one after another I draw near, not one do I miss. An attendant follows holding a tray. He carries a refuse pail, soon to be filled with clotted rags and blood, emptied and filled again. I onward go, I stop. With hinged knees and steady hand to dress wounds, I am firm with each. The pangs are sharp yet unavoidable. One turns to me, his appealing eyes. Poor boy, I never knew you, yet I think I could not refuse this moment to die for you, if that would save you. Thus in silence and dreams projections, returning, resuming, I thread my way through the hospitals. The hurt and wounded I pacify with soothing hand. I sit by the restless all the dark night. Some are so young, some suffer so much. I recall the experience sweet and sad. Many a soldier's loving arms about this neck have crossed and rested. Many a soldier's kiss dwells on these bearded lips. Thank you.
One photo, Paul, thanks. Oh, Mark's already got his hand up. He's got a very loud voice there. You want to shout or no?
I can scream.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was really profound. Really, really profound. I'm also working quite a lot on psychedelic chaplaincy as a practice and in theory as well. And yeah, this notion, I mean, especially the story about providing a room to express anger to God and opening up lamentations. My question is quite simple. Is there room for, and I think you do accommodate for this, but I'd like you maybe, if you could explore it a little bit, is there room for a psychedelic chaplaincy outside of the clinic? Given that chaplaincy has also a historical role to play in hospices, in prisons, in schools, universities, etc. Thank you.
Specifically, psychedelic chaplaincy.
Psychedelic chaplaincy outside the clinic. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for sure. I mean, sometimes this has been put to me. I'll be in a conversation with somebody, and then afterward they'll say, "Were you chaplaining me?" I think there's a sense that you're kind of always carrying it with you, and I think it is a set of skills that could be easily picked up by anyone of interest. I would imagine, so the Zendo project is really compelling to me, that goes to festival spaces and provides a sort of container for bad trips.
I haven't heard of Zendo, but in the UK we have PsyCare,
Yeah.
Cosmic Care,
And I think
Zendo. Okay.
containers like that would be, I don't think they don't have a spiritual care or chaplaincy model. I think in the festival world, chaplaincy makes a lot of sense. So I think that, I mean, it's yes is the much shorter answer.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I'll do that.
Just stop share.
Paul, just the second one Mark said, brilliant talk. Thank you very much, very thought-provoking. You mentioned hermeneutics of novelty. And I'm interested to ask another question, which is integration itself a hermeneutic activity, but a second order hermeneutic activity? Because the subject themselves has to interpret their own experience and then communicate it to a chaplain, who then has to perform a second order hermeneutic act. And are there dangers in that, given the distance from what that person's cognized contents of their experience?
Yeah, I mean, this is the second part of your question. Certainly, dangers is one word. Misunderstandings or you're always falling short, I think, will be the case. This is I think that the mathematical image of this calculation of the sum, it's always an approximation. You're never getting quite there. And I think that integration is the same. You will always be doing something inadequate to the task of interpreting your experience in correspondence with the rest of your life. But that's the game. I mean, I think we sort of work within that sense of inadequacy and don't avoid it. Avoid the fact that will always be a sort of inadequate inadequate task.
There's a long history of biblical hermeneutics, but should there be a sort of hermeneutics of chaplaincy to help people to understand what people might be saying about their own experience?
Yeah, I think there's a book about this. Maybe the title is The Hermeneutics of Chaplaincy or something like that. There's somebody who's a biblical scholar who's also in the spiritual care world wrote about this sort of interpretive enterprise. I think if it's interpretation that the care seeker is doing, I think that's great. The point of concern I have is where the facilitator, whether a therapist, a chaplain, whoever else, is offering up interpretation for the person. I think a lot of my other work is on Deleuze, and so I bring a lot of that into my chaplaincy work, and he's always marking a space between interpretation and experimentation. And I think it is always open to the chaplain to offer protocol for experimentation. What would it look like if this were the mantra? What would it mean if how do we proliferate experimental protocol and let interpretation be the project of the care seeker?
Thanks. That was a fantastic talk. And yeah, well, I look, hopefully, sorry, because we're doing quite badly for time, but hopefully we'll be able to get all of our speakers back together. I love the talking about integration, bringing together the mathematical formula and talking about hope, because that's something we encounter in our work. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Ros, who is here. We were not sure she was coming, but do you need water or anything? Were you all right? No. And Ros Watts, yeah, do you want to sit on that? Yeah, you sit on that stool.
Introduce her because we had to, because
we took her from the break. She needs no introduction. So Ros, who now runs the ASA, is it an institute or organization? ASA integration organization. Previously worked at Imperial College on a lot of the psilocybin trials there, developing the therapy protocols, integration protocols. And then I think, well, maybe this is something you'll talk about as a response to that. It's gone into the community, setting up integration programs there. It's doing lots and lots of other wonderful things, which maybe you get time to talk about the Love and Grief program too, if you get the chance. So yeah, over to Ros.
Is this on? That's on. It's on. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I not infectious anymore, but still very brain foggy. So I was planning to write this talk in the last few days, but have been in bed with high fever and bad COVID. So I'm just going to speak from the heart and see what flows. But I so wanted to be here because this is so important. I'm just so happy it's happening. A whole 2-day gathering about integration. And I'm so glad it's happening here as well with so many wonderful people and such an exciting department at Exeter. It's really, joyful to be here for the first time. So I will maybe talk a little bit about how the ASA integration program developed out of the clinical work, and then talk a bit about how it works and maybe how we are working at the local community level. So, and I wanted to say as well, lovely talk, Paul, thank you so much for that. And Geoff, also beautiful talk. And if I had more of a brain cell, I was going to try and weave together thoughts I had listening to you talk, but now I'm sitting up here, they've all disappeared into the ether. So I'm just going to see what comes. So when I was working at Imperial on the clinical trial, psilocybin for depression, I became aware quite quickly of how people's psychedelic experiences would fade when they went back to their usual lives. So, well, not their psychedelic experiences, but the connectedness that they could feel. So we worked a lot in our team about thinking of the mechanisms, and one of the mechanisms we looked at was connectedness to self, community, and nature. And that there's a scale developed to measure that connectedness with those 3 different subscales. And watching people over the course of the 2 studies feel this connectedness. One person described it as having the lights in a dark house turned on and he could see his life again, but then the lights faded again. Because, I was so fascinated by this issue, and I can't wait to hear more about it later, this issue that in Indigenous cultures and Indigenous places, there's no need for integration. And that makes complete sense on the basis of how much more connected to land, to place, to community. In an in-situ community, where you're going to a place to drink medicine that you understand, with elders from a lineage that you understand, and you're part of a community that are going through a long cyclical process of journeying and integrating and journeying and integrating, that it's part of the way you live, there is no need for integration. So without knowing anything about the anthropological evidence, I just feel that I can so feel how our culture has deviated so far from that kind of connectedness. And it's a great sadness to me that yeah, I mean, going back to actually Geoff's presentation, you know, decades of neoliberalism and what it's done, it's like a real poverty. It feels like a poverty in our culture, like a spiritual poverty, a connectedness poverty, and just this absolute kind of, yeah, disconnection that we often don't even feel because we don't know what it is to live in a different way. So realized in the trial that people were feeling depressed again afterwards, and that the academic papers don't really show that because they only measure up to a certain point. And clinical trials can't really offer the kind of integration that we kind of culturally need, because they're medical research trials. They're measuring a drug, and so they have to have a cutoff point, and they can't really go into the therapeutic support afterwards. So we have the system where there's this kind of emptiness. We're bringing in these psychedelic clinical trials, but we don't yet have the cultural containers and the language and just the container. We don't have the container. So it feels like we need to kind of rebuild a culture of care, a culture of understanding, and a slow, steady process and framework for helping people integrate these experiences, but also live by them too, which can be very difficult to do in kind of fragmented modern society. So, and actually to think of an analogy here as well. So before I talk about how ASA works, which is what we kind of developed to try and start, you know, it's like a drop in the ocean, but an attempt to start to try and rebuild that container, and using the indigenous wisdom of the land that we ourselves are from, which is Celtic, Druidry. I know so little, and I'm amongst people that know so much, so I'm kind of embarrassed to even mention it, but I will talk about how we've kind of started to weave in, well, it's the wisdom of trees, it's the wisdom of land, which is all of our birthright. But yeah, so before I get on to that, the analogy, I remember when I first started working in psychedelic research some years ago now, watching a presentation, which at the time I was like really, really passionate about and felt really inspired by. And it was, you know, really important in its day. It was about how if we think about the analogy of mental illness or suffering or depression as like a toothache, then we could see antidepressants as like a painkiller, and psychedelics as like an antibiotic getting to the roots of the infection of the tooth, which is a powerful idea. So psychedelics can be an antibiotic to get to the root of the infection rather than just numbing the symptoms, the pain, the tooth pain. But now I don't see it that way anymore, because I think to see the problem, the root of the problem, as an individual person's toothache is missing the context, in that surely the real root, yes, what's causing that person's pain is the infection at the base of their tooth, but really the cause is a culture that feeds the tooth constant sugar and does not provide any dental care, which is essentially the world that we're living in. So when we recontextualize everything and think, okay, so we've got this project of psychedelic therapy, we're all trying to, you know, we're trying to make people feel better. People that have been suffering, we want them to get relief. We want people to be able to be creative. We want people to be able to access these spiritual states and communion, all these beautiful things. But if we don't look at the context, and if we're not really eyes open to that, then we're kind of colluding with that system, and we're patching things up without changing the real problem. So it's this, what do we do? And I guess, you know, what I decided to do was something very small, and it is still very small, and it's just it's a small community, and I don't know how much difference it's going to ultimately make beyond the lives of the people that are doing it. And me, I'm, feel very privileged to be working in this way. I love it, but it's not like it's going to change the world. But I also saw this quote that said, an island of coherence in a sea of chaos can shift the whole something thing to a higher order. So I got this idea of islands of connectedness, and how can we create these islands of connectedness? And they're certainly not just online, that's for sure, but the ASA community is essentially an online community, but which people then take some of the practices to their local community to create these little islands of connectedness and islands of coherence. So how long have I got, by the way, Celia?
How long you want?
Okay.
Maybe like 10 more.
Okay, thank you.
We can then get the other speakers up.
Yeah. So broadly what ASA is, it stands for Accept, Connect, Embody, Restore. And it is essentially a community for people. It's open to anybody that is engaging in psychedelic exploration, or just engaging in exploration of deeper states of consciousness, from breath work, from meditation, or through personal crisis. We have some people in the community who just had huge life events that made them question everything, and they felt they wanted a community of people to process this big change with. So the core principle of it is it's a kind of fellowship, although I don't like that word because it's very gendered. It's I can't think of another word. It's a kind of fellowship, a bit like AA with kind of 12 steps, although we have 12 trees, and they work as a kind of around the calendar. So it's an ongoing cyclical process. So if you imagine a kind of a calendar, like a clock, not a clock, like a cyclical circle with 12 trees going round, and each tree is a different month, and each month has a different theme, and the tree teacher of that month teaches us the theme. And I have come to really feel trees as teachers now, and I relate to them in a completely different way to how I did before. And we connect deeply to each tree and its lesson. And for people who haven't yet really got into the trees or connected with them, they can just connect with the lesson. June, we're in now, which is Hawthorn Tree, which is about forgiveness of ourselves, forgiveness of others. July, we move into welcoming all parts of ourselves. That's based on IFS, internal family systems. I won't go through all of them, but you can still relate to the theme, even if you don't relate to the idea of the tree as the teacher. And we as a community start every month with a film about that tree and its message and its meaning, and then a tree journey, which is a guided imagery journey with music. And we have these experiences together in like online workshops where we merge with the tree. And it sounds quite zany, but people have really profound experiences with the music, going into and they use certain breathwork techniques as well. And people have insights and revelations and ideas and discuss it in sharing circles. And it's based around their psychedelic experiences, but weaving it into a kind of fabric of life. So wherever people have been in their journeys, they then enter into this framework of this 12-step process, and they bring with them whatever they need to bring with them. And it's very non-directive in that people can kind of explore the meanings of their own journeys in their own ways. And we have different sharing circles and all sorts of different breathwork sessions and things. But it's a kind of non-directive community container where we all have this shared framework. And I'll just say a little bit about the local work. So when the first cohort, we've had 4 cohorts of 60 people. It's a year-long process. People have to pay. I didn't want to take any VC funding after very bad experiences with the corporate world and psychedelics. So I funded it all with a personal loan, which has meant that we've kind of, people have to pay, and the whole thing is kind of stitched together with kind of sticky tape and wire. It's very kind of scruffy around the edges, but the real thing about it is meeting each other and having these chances to connect with each other. And the sharing circles are really places to be very authentic. And And we have facilitators of the sharing circles who have been through the process. So the model of it is that when people have been through the 12 trees themselves, they can then become facilitators for future cohorts. So our facilitators now include various people, some of whom are therapists, but also include some of the people in the original Imperial trial who, after the trial stopped because of COVID, didn't have integration, which is kind of why I set it up in the first place. They went through the ASA program and they're now some of our facilitators. So that's amazing to see. And they've also set up their own organization called PsyPan, which is Psychedelic Participants Advocacy Network. So it's a melting pot of kind of creativity as well. And people keep starting new projects and new ideas. And so the local work is that when people finish the first year, some of the people, they said that they wanted to keep going, which we're really, really surprised about, because the idea was we kind of show you the framework and then you've got your friends that you were in ASA with, and you can just go offline and have a WhatsApp group and you can meet every month and continue with the process. But quite a lot of people wanted to carry on within the community. So we decided that for those people, they were our elders. And we started an elder orchard for our elder trees. And they now, not all of them, but many of them now do something called outegration, which is you've integrated for a year, you've been through these trees, you've absorbed the wisdom of the trees, the lessons of the lessons of nature, the nature codes, the grounding, we call it psychological photosynthesis, which is like turning the mud at the roots to sap that makes the leaves grow. We have all these kind of ways of like metaphors for psychological flexibility and psychological growth and connection, not just to yourself, but to others and the world around you. People do tree planting. And so they've done that year of all that stuff for themselves. And then in the year 2, outegration, we give them some of the tree journey meditations and some of the videos and some of the other materials. And they've started local groups where it's for free, there's no money changing hands, but they just go, they do it in their living room or they hire a space and they just get people in their local community to come that don't know much about psychedelics, aren't particularly interested in trees, and they have these groups together. And the feedback from that has been the most rewarding of all of it, because just that sense of the kind of the spreading, that's the idea of these ideas spreading beyond this little core group of us. And it's really moving to hear how people who are living in communities who are disconnected from each other, they don't know each other, they're longing. There's that poverty of connectedness that we have. People are absolutely, and the question about, do we need chaplaincy in the community? Yes, our communities have been so depleted. And like, if you think of it as like soil, just like part, the same way the soil of our actual earth depleted, too many pesticides, not enough goodness, erosion, not enough root connection, not enough structure, and it erodes and erodes. And so it's like, it's bringing some of that root structure, that mycelium back. And those groups, some of them are starting to think about communal food preparation and growing vegetables together. So it's like from that little seed of local organizing, I think it's important in the times that are coming to have those local connections as well. And just the very final thing, there's lots of different things that the ASA community is like spanning into, but one of the ones that you mentioned, Celia, was we've started a group of, it's kind of the ASA group, some of our facilitators and some of our elders, but it goes beyond that as well. It's a group of volunteer therapists who've come together to offer these events online to have difficult conversations. So I think in the psychedelic field, it's still such a young field, and there's a real lack of place, kind of forums to kind of come together and talk about some of the challenging things. So the most recent one that we had was, it was the original event was for Valentine's Day, and it was called Love and Grief in the Shadow of War. And it was because it was Valentine's Day, and we'd been talking a lot in our community about how devastated we were by what we were seeing in our news feeds, and how it felt very difficult to really focus on anything else, and how we were kind of like thirsting for a place to talk about it. So we invited some speakers, amazing speakers, to come and share their perspectives and just have a space for grief. I think we need spaces for grief in these times, and but also very much from the tree work is we did a lot of work around grief and love being mirror images of each other, that our grief shows us what we care about, what we want to stand for. And we think about it as like the roots and the branches of a tree. So the grief is what your roots have had to grow around, all the rocks your roots have had to grow around, everything that's been there in the darkness, all the pushing, all the unknowing, all the sense of like confusion, the roots pushing down through everything. And that every centimeter of growth at the roots is reflected by a centimeter of growth at the branches. And the pain that we go through really is what shows us what we care about, what we love, what we want to stand for. And the idea of our branches kind of growing out to the light, strengthened by everything that they've had to push down at the roots. And that when we really connect to our grief, we connect to each other because we know that the trees are all connected at the mycelial layer to each other. And so we're not alone in our grief. We stand with each other. We feel it with each other. It gives us strength to really feel it, whatever's there, and feel our tears, but feel what that shows us about what we love. So we use that idea of the forest, of like in these times we need a forest, to have these group calls where it's kind of like we create a forest to have these difficult conversations together. The last one we had, which was in May, was Love and Grief in the Shadow of Psychedelic Narcissism. And that one was really started by, events in the community linked to a kind of psychedelic luminary, and, a shock related to events that had unfolded. And that sense of like, where do we talk about this? And so we asked some experts in the field to come and speak, and we had sharing circles, and we had a tree meditation at the end, like we did in the first event. And we had all of our volunteer therapists that are there to hold these sharing circles. And they were both beautiful events with loads of just very authentic connection, and people saying that they were really thirsting for something like that and that they hadn't found it before. And yeah, it was just really moving as well, because before we did the event, we put out a call and said, if anybody has been affected by psychedelic narcissism, please get in touch with us. Leave us an anonymous kind of testimony so that we can include your voices. And we received a lot of testimonies, and some of them were really, there's a lot of work we need to do, of course, as a new field, in really creating the support structures, the root networks, so that people feel heard and feel safe, and that there's places for people to go to when something goes wrong in a clinical trial or in a psychedelic retreat. And so just one more thing to mention is PsyAware, which is a new organization that's been set up by Anya Alexiuk, who she makes all the films for ASA. And she's set up an organization which is to support people who have suffered harms in the psychedelic space and who have had challenges with psychedelic narcissism. So yeah, people can look up PsyAware. It's just started if you know anybody that needs support in that kind of way. But really, I suppose overall, what I'm really kind of hoping for is that we can, a kind of ecosystem starts to really, really develop, where, of course, we have the medical model and we have this very kind of, the kind of corporate capitalist kind of mission forward, but that alongside that, we have, we create these kind of islands of connectedness. And I guess that's what these conferences are for, so that, yeah, people really feel kind of cared for in the long term, not just for a few weeks, not just for a few months, but that there's caring places that people can connect to in an ongoing way. And then just remembering actually something that I heard Christine Housekeller say in a podcast, which is that from speaking to somebody in an Indigenous elder using plant medicine, who said, it's only when you've forgotten the song of the trees, or you don't know the song of the trees, that you need the psychedelic plants. That it's the song of the trees that we really need, which is interconnectedness. So I guess, yeah, whether or not the ASA community, it's moving out of the psychedelic field, and it's more about helping us all remember the song of the plants, of that interconnectedness. So if anybody would like to join us, you're very welcome. And yeah, thank you very much. And sorry for being very waffly and misdirected.
Fantastic talk, especially as well, given how you've been really unwell. We won't probably have time to get everyone together, so because of my very poor time management. No, stay here. I was thinking maybe people would have a couple of questions for you, and then you'll be here all together. So hopefully we'll continue integrating and weaving between what you've said. Has anyone got any questions for Roz on that? Alex? Oh, do you want a microphone? But you've also got a loud voice. Hold on.
Hi, Roz. I've kind of watched your ASA vision from quite a way back. And it's really nice to see it get where it needs to be. I'm really happy that it's kind of almost generated its own momentum. Given, I suppose, the general topic here is about clinical application of integration or a place for integration within a clinical setting. Just wonder what you think. Do you think it's possible? It seems like quite antithetical to what you're kind of doing, not in a critical way. It seems more genuine the way you're doing it. I'm just wondering do you see it being possible? I suppose that's my question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that was a kind of a general one. Sorry to not pinning it. Anyone else wants to jump in, they can.
Yeah. I suppose there's the immediate integration after a trial that's, you know, we really can't do without the kind of the day after and maybe the week after as well. And that connection to the people that have been the guides in the study is so important. It would be horrible to be without that. Although I have seen some companies completely trying to remove all of the therapy and all of the integration. And so realistically, we might be moving in that direction, that the integration gets reduced and reduced and reduced down as, you know, some of the bigger companies are framing them more as kind of, you know, pharmaceutical, interventions without the therapy. But I think, yeah, we can't really do without that talking through afterwards. But I don't think these kind of clinical trial medical frameworks can ever really support people in this kind of way long term, just because, yeah, it would be so. It's also very, if a company that was trying to prove a psychedelic was successful, then like funded the community work afterwards, it would all feel as if it was a little bit kind of slightly. I don't like the idea of big kind of capitalist corporations kind of controlling the kind of cultural integration of it, because I feel it needs to be more, we need to be countering that. So I think grassroots, community, ongoing, local support feels like if we do without that, we're kind of missing the point. And we can only really do grassroots community by grassroots community. So, I mean, what I hope is that there'll be lots of different kind of grassroots community things to all kind of weave together. But yeah, I don't think it can really happen through the trials, don't think. But I'd be really interested to know Paul, what do you think?
I have a question. I have a couple questions. I'll ask one now and maybe another one later. I'm curious if you could tell us just a bit more about the trees, how you chose the 12, and perhaps what one might expect from any given tree.
Oh, that's my favorite question. Thank you. So, yeah, how to describe it? I think when you really, really connect with the tree in a really embodied way, and it's easier to do it under the influence of a psychedelic. I don't know if many people here have had the experience of really connecting with the feel of a tree, the rootedness, the strength. Yeah, it's a kind of very grounded, deep-rooted solidity. So when we do a tree journey, we essentially imagine, so the journey's all kind of, you kind of imagine you're walking along, they're in different landscapes, and then you imagine this particular tree, and everyone will imagine a different one. And then you kind of sit with your back against it and you feel your torso merge with the tree. And as you're breathing, you go from breathing in oxygen and breathing out carbon dioxide to breathing in carbon dioxide and breathing out oxygen. So you're slowly starting to become the tree. And we do this particular breathing exercise where you're kind of breathing up from the floor, up through your body, up to your crown. And so I think there is an element of slight kind of consciousness shifting that you do from this kind of breathwork experience. But you really kind of, you develop an awareness of kind of like the sunlight kind of on your forehead and the kind of depth of your roots. And from that kind of going up and down through that polarity through your body, we then kind of introduce some of the ideas of that theme. But when you're in that kind of you're in that deeper state already, people aren't thinking about it in a kind of conscious, rational way. It's much more coming from the kind of inner wisdom, the inner intelligence. And how I chose the trees, well, so the first tree encounter was I had my own experience with a tree in a very difficult, very, very difficult moment, kind of dark night of the soul, kind of like, pits of, it was in COVID, and there was this kind of like, just kind of chaos of everything unraveling. And it was, a moment of like just complete, when you just feel completely like shocked and stunned by something and just kind of like outrage. And I kind of stumbled I just went to the bottom of the garden because my daughter was in the house and I didn't want to have my kind of outrage in her presence. So I held my outrage in, marched to the bottom of the garden in the rain. And then when I got to this tree, I just kind of like unleashed it all. And I had this real feeling of the tree holding me, and that I was in the presence of a consciousness that was present. And I didn't really think about whether it was real or I was imagining or what it was, but it was a feeling of, I can't remember any particular words, but it was like, you are held, you are rooted. And it was the feeling of seeing the tree, how knobbly and gnarly and spiky, and it had this great big kind of scar in the middle of it, and just realizing how trees, they live through the storms and how resilient, and they just keep going. So that was my first experience. That was a field maple tree. But then as a result of that, I read lots of books about the Celtic tree calendar. And it was from the Celtic tree calendar that I designed the first iteration, which Adrian and I piloted together at Synthesis. And that was the first version of the 12 trees. But then ASA developed a bit more with more people from America. So we put in some American trees. And so the trees have just, we have a kind of like, we're going to add some new trees in soon as well from various different places. But it's kind of a bit random how they presented themselves. But Philip Carr-Gomm, who is like chief druid, or was chief druid, gave me I was like, is it okay to like change? Is it okay to like mess around with the trees? Like, will the druids like think that's bad if I like add in new ones? And he said, it's all stories, these are all stories that we're telling. And, the Celtic tree calendar is a story, and you're just adding a new chapter to the story. So hopefully it's okay.
Andy. Oh, thanks so much, Ros. We do have a lot of lovely trees here. We haven't planned this, but I was wondering we can maybe nobble you into giving us some tree experiences over the next 2 days. But just sorry, we have run out of time, and we need to go and have lunch. But thanks again to all of our speakers for a really wonderful session. Paul and Geoff and Ros, and I'm sure you can catch them over the next few days.